Welcome back to the Media and Society. We've explored a broad landscape of D&I in both the US and the UK. Now let's delve into the specific strategies and actions that professionals are taking to advance D&I in their organizations. Sophia, can you start by sharing some of the innovative D&I practices you've observed?
So a practice that I find, well, people consider it innovative, I think it should be the basic and the default that we should be doing all the time is equality impact assessments, where whenever you're introducing, let's say, a new policy, even if it doesn't seem directly related to inequalities or to an underrepresented group, to look at how it's going to affect different people. So, for example, it could be that, let's say you're a government department or a borough council, for instance, and you're looking at raising a certain tax that would affect individual households, then some of the analysis around that would be, how is that going to affect, for instance, single mothers? How is that going to affect racial minorities? How is that going to affect perhaps people who are disabled and not in the workforce due to their disabilities? How will that affect people who are perhaps disabled and working part-time or have a reduced income due to their disabilities? That's what an equity impact assessment would be looking at. And when you have those embedded, when it's part of the muscle memory of an organization, of a government, and when it is done by a public body, you are actually able to request a copy of it and see what the outcome was. So I really love the information rights access that exists in the UK. I think that's special, and it creates greater transparency and ease of benchmarking.
Let's lean on that about the information rights, because similar here in the US, they do have information rights for, I'm no lawyer, my brother is, but they do have rules towards providing information that the government has to exercise and give people opportunity to get information. Are you finding that there is an exceptional amount of bias because think about it, in a lot of the minoritized populations, some probably don't have access to a great amount of tech, right? And tech is what drives information and obtaining and giving information. But like, and I'll use in our example here in the US, we have areas just here in our state, Virginia. If you go down to Southern Virginia, there are areas that don't have access to internet, right? That T-Mobile and Verizon and AT&T, those companies have had to go in and provide what they call MiFi devices so they can have mobile cellular-based internet access. And this happens with them going to school, not being able to take their tests, not having internet access at home, things like that. So are you finding that there's an exceptional amount of bias where they still don't have access to obtain that information once this is enacted?
Absolutely. There's an extreme reliance on apps at the moment, even in terms of people's physical freedom to move around. We saw quite a lot of that in the pandemic in particular. Many different services, or to access letters, for example, the default will become having an app on your phone. And that will really affect people that are digitally excluded, which will tend to affect along income lines, along age lines as well, and can also make things at times more difficult. If, let's say, someone needs to access a translator, it's perhaps easier for that person to take a physical letter than it is to take their phone, which may or may not be connected to the internet, or the battery could die, or they may not be equipped to use their phone to its maximum capability. I know many of us have stories of helping and supporting our parents to use their phones or to increase the size of text. So digital exclusion is becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger issue. And a lot of people are off the grid in terms of the internet. And many libraries in the UK in particular are being closed down, even though they're the main source of free internet.
Okay. Let's talk about transparency. How is transparency for in the world of D&I? How is it working in the UK? Meaning, is the government forcing organizations to be transparent? Are the private sector organizations being more transparent in how their hiring practices, who they're hiring? Since they really don't have quotas, how are they creating an environment that is all encompassing and bringing the best talent but also from the minoritized community? How are they doing that if there's no transparent, if they have transparency or don't have transparency?
With very little consistency is the short answer.
Okay.
So there is some limited transparency in, for example, gender pay gap reporting. So companies over, I believe, around 250 employees did have the requirement to report and to report on their gender pay gap. But the majority of companies do not have more than 250 employees. The majority of employees in the workforce are not necessarily in those big companies.
Mm-hmm.
And that is only one characteristic. So it's only now that it's looking more likely that, for example, ethnicity pay gap reporting or ethnicity pay gap protections, for instance, will be introduced. But that was a long fight, a very long fight. And in terms of transparency, so for instance, if it is a public sector body, then you could actually request certain things under the Freedom of Information Act. You could ask for what proportion of their workforce is declared as having X, Y, and Z characteristic. That's more available in public entities. But a lot of people are employed in the private sector or in nonprofits or in tech, you name it. And on the basis of that, it's then coming down quite often in the UK to the discretion of individual companies. I would say that within DEI, I would hope that it is the majority of us have the ethos of, with transparency and particularly with data transparency, we have a greater ability to improve the situation. We need something to know what the baseline is. You need to know what you're improving on. You need to know the current state of affairs. Or without that, you can still introduce certain changes, but it will be difficult to prove what the impact was. And then that also creates difficulty in getting that buy-in, in demonstrating those wins that you're having, and also just knowing if you've addressed where the problem areas are, because otherwise there is guesswork, and guesswork will often be based on who is able to speak the loudest, what the most easily apparent or visible issues are, rather than perhaps the full range of issues applicable to an environment, which is why auditing becomes really important.
So lead into that a little more. So you as Moreau Consulting, you go into an organization, how do you start?
How do I start? So the way that I start with an audit is, for one, we'll try and develop questionnaire and quantitative as well as qualitative metrics. So we'll try and find out, for example, they might have a really low level of response to demographic questions, which is really common because we've got that narrative of it's optional. You don't need to answer that. You need to answer these sections of a form, but not that. That's optional. And it is optional. However, people don't necessarily know why that's asked. You can't necessarily ask for changes easily anyway to be made to benefit or consider the strife of different populations if you're not able to show, okay, this is impacting 10% of our workforce, or we only have 5% representation from this group, whereas the average in our industry is 25%. Why is that happening? So what I try to do when I first enter an organization and do an audit is, when we're doing that questionnaire, that survey, that research piece, is ask them to carve it out into all employee schedules time to do that questionnaire. Because if the barrier for entry is perhaps all the other things that they need to do, they see this as taking away from, maybe they have some monthly all-team meeting. Maybe each team has some type of check-in with their manager or the team leader of that team. In which case, I would ask that for 1 week, half an hour to an hour of that meeting, it's cameras off, just do that questionnaire. Because then it's not adding to people's workload for that week. And it may, for instance, be substituting on, let's talk about our social calendar for the next 6 months. Or here's an update from the CEO, which could perhaps come in the next team meeting. So I try and carve it into everyone's diary, make it easy for people to do that form. And then we'll suddenly see that response rates are more in the 80 to 90 something percentage. Okay. Which means you have a stronger evidence base. And then it's about going in and actually having conversations with people. And that, again, is at least 80 to 90% communication and framing, explaining why they're being asked for their contributions. What impact could it have? How will it be going? What is the level of confidentiality? So I give people options, and I give anyone who's facilitating a focus group or an interview options where they're supposed to say, are you sharing things for my awareness? Are you sharing things to inform my recommendations? Are you comfortable with me quoting you? If so, I'll let you look over the quote. And people are actually surprisingly candid in what they end up sharing, because then you're able to actually demonstrate what they've been going through. It's not uncommon for things that are completely illegal to only be unearthed at this stage, because it's fraught with repercussions if you're sharing those things, at least in the public perception, if you're sharing those things with someone internal who can identify you, who hasn't clarified where information will go or what will be done with it or what could come back on you.
Mhm.
Then you have an evidence base on which to make those recommendations. And then you've also spoken with enough people who can perhaps get real buy-in and investment on what happens next.
See, so I hope I didn't make you give out all your industry secrets, So let me ask you this. So how does a person just come to get to work with you? Do they just go to your website, or is it you're getting a lot of just like, so you worked with one company, they recommend you, like, how are they getting to work with you?
Excellent question. So the ones that come through my website, I don't necessarily initially know how they found me.
Mm-hmm.
More often than not, it will be, for example, audiences at public speaking engagements I've done. We do quite a lot of press work as well. So just earlier today, I was giving a quote on an article on the representation of racial minorities in remote working as a relief from perhaps the racism and microaggressions in their workplaces. So when you do expert contributions, at times people will come through that way, because then they've accessed your approach, your outlook, your ethos, and your advice and guidance through a free and no obligation avenue in that sense. So sometimes I'll also do public trainings and open source delegate trainings where your company doesn't need to have committed. You can just sign up yourself and see what it's all about. Another avenue is that I release some guidance documentation and booklets and such. So some people have found me through the book on how to diversify your charity's board,
Mm-hmm.
or how to diversify your board more generally. Those are, I'd say, probably the main avenues. And of course, recommendation.
Okay. See, I'm promoting S. Moreau, so you all know she's a real deal, guys, and she can help your organization out. Try to get you back over in the U.S. too. So mentorship and sponsorship, they're very important, especially, and now there's a big push within the whole spectrum of the U.S. DNI movement, really to help more women get more mentorship, but also Black people here and minorities here in the United States to gain more mentorships. Typically, the way, and I'm sure you know this, but mentorship, to our audience, you got to understand, is those people that have mentors, the mentor actually gains a benefit. They usually get promoted, just like the mentee tends to get promoted alongside, or because of having that relationship with a good mentor. How are you all doing that in the UK? Do you guys put an emphasis on mentorship and sponsorship, so to speak?
Sponsorship isn't spoken of as much in the UK. Sometimes it will all fall under the umbrella of mentorship. So there's a lot of goodwill behind the concept of mentorship in the UK, but it's not necessarily structured. It will just be seen in very general terms as someone knowledgeable or experienced or successful,
Mm-hmm.
giving guidance to someone who isn't, basically. And what this sometimes means is that a lot of mentoring relationships do fizzle out, or they lack structure and people don't know what to expect of the other, which is a real shame, because a lot of the mentoring that is happening very informally and with people who already have structural power. So they'll be getting guidance and mentoring on, here's what I do, here's what my field is, here's how I negotiated my first pay rise, here's how I made contacts and got investors, etc. And that might not necessarily be known as formal mentoring in the same way, because maybe it came through someone's dad's friend or a partner in their mother's law firm, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas some of the mentoring that may have come through, for instance, a program to increase diversity in an area, sometimes the feedback will be that people didn't know what it was supposed to involve, or that there was a lack of clarity and boundaries, or that there was some disappointment or letdown that happened. So I'd say mentoring needs to have a little bit more structure and clarity and demystification, really. But it's hugely impactful because it's access to information. And it's a way to access information and knowledge and guidance that doesn't rely on formal education systems and the careers advice that effectively doesn't exist in any of our schools, really, or very few schools.
How do the young people really get involved in trying to find a mentor or sponsor or whatever?
So I have something potentially controversial to say about this, which is that I won't often see young people reaching out and asking for mentorship or seeking out a sponsor unless they have had access to some form of privilege in the past. The few times that I've seen it were usually young people who came from families where everyone was a leader in some field. All of the adults were high flyers in some field or another, and probably shared their journeys that may have involved mentoring in the past.
Okay.
Who were typically, for example, privately educated and from very affluent backgrounds, then they are more likely to be familiar with even the concept of mentoring and what mentoring can achieve, and are very clear and specific in what they want out of that mentor as well, so they come prepared. It's less likely that I've seen mentoring, and I say this as someone who's also been on different formalized and informal mentoring programs, and I've really enjoyed and benefited from mentoring myself. It's more rare to see that proactive seeking out of mentorship from someone who's just not familiar with the concept before. It's often a reflection of what information someone's had access to in the past.
So is it that it's just not a big, it's not really a big thing in the UK at this point, to push it out in the forefront, or people just don't really know about it unless you come from money, so to speak?
People don't really know about it as much. I would say in its formalized context, it's more in the vein of, for example, executive coaching, but perhaps like the earlier career version of executive coaching where you're getting guidance from someone very senior in that field. At times, there can also be some distrust in different communities around, and it's not unfounded distrust either, around how it's a way of making people who have a lot of power feel good about themselves because they're taking you under their wing and they're saving you.
Yep.
So there is some, at times, stigma around like, this is a savior mission rather than something that's actually going to benefit me, and I'm not clear on what this will actually do for me. So mentorship does need more demystification around it, I feel, because of the benefits that it has.
Okay, let's dive into this before we get out of here for this last segment. Let's talk a little more, leaning more into women. What are women doing to help the next set of women come up, and not be so distant? Is there a distance between women that are executives, or are the women starting to uplift others? Are you seeing that?
So what I'm seeing that is at times cause for disappointment is many women who are currently in executive positions or who have a lot of influence and authority in a particular field will have been there for a long time. And the strife that they experience can sometimes make them really passionate, which is a beautiful thing. And they may even be transparent about their stories and the barriers they faced and their journeys. And at times, perhaps unsympathetic to the barriers being raised by the new generation of women that are entering and progressing in the workforce, by the level of transparency that they share of, for example, do we really need to have that meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning on Monday when I need to also do the school run and it's difficult to get childcare at that time of day? Because sometimes people will be thinking, well, this is what I had to go through in order to get to this point. You should see the things I went through back then. So at times their level of tolerance for potential for exclusion in the workforce will be based on standards that they developed in a different time. And there's always, of course, that two different schools of thought. I went through this, so you should too. And I went through this and you shouldn't have to.
And when you go into an organization and you see that this might be a issue, what are you telling them so it doesn't hurt their feelings?
Well, acknowledging the fact that they do have understanding due to shared certain types of experience, and acknowledging that, not dismissing it, because at times that will be the defense. Sometimes people's responses to challenge and criticism and the things that are essentially intended for us to grow will be, but X, Y, and Z. They'll start listing things they've been through. They'll start listing the empathy that they have and that they share, etc. So just start out by acknowledging that, and that the areas that perhaps need some growth, some work, or a different approach, do not take away from that. So that can help address some of the defensiveness and fragility, but also to just gently challenge through logical examples and probing them to clarify why they think that that is the only approach that works. So a very common one is, well, of course we need to cut this person's hours because she's not able to work before 9 a.m. or after 3 o'clock because she needs to do the school run, and we're not paying someone to be there when they can't be in the office. Then it's a question of, okay, does their job necessitate for them to be in the office? Are they able to do the tasks that can be done remotely outside of those hours? Are you, for example, considering that the most of the people who will be doing school journeys are going to be women? Usually that type of labor is gendered labor that will often fall on mothers. Another thing to consider is, okay, you're saying that we don't need to consider that, but have you looked at what your paternity leave policies look like? Are we not looking at why it's not also fathers that are taking on some of these roles? Because you do have fathers in the workforce as well. So if they then try and say, well, we don't need to accommodate this, and why doesn't she ask her husband? And say, well, have you not looked at, usually men will only access perhaps a week or two of paternity leave. So are you reinforcing that dynamic actually in the way that you've planned your policies and your practices in the workplace? And then just posing some alternatives and seeing their response. For instance, flexible working. A lot of that stuff will be unfamiliar at times to people who felt, I'm not discriminating because I'm not saying that we should fire this person. I just think that if we open this door, we have to let it happen for everyone else. Or if we give one person some flexible working, it could be seen as a workplace benefit and other people will kick up a fuss. And then it's about framing and tackling some of these fears, because at times it's not always logic based, and people will sometimes think that something is based on logic because perhaps they haven't been forced to confront it in different stages and consider all the alternatives with support.
You know what's, and I say what's interesting, and something you said kind of spearheaded this thought. But during COVID, what it did here in the U.S. and I'm sure the rest of the world, it really pushed the marketplace to move towards a work from home environment. It pushed that majorly here in the U.S. And what they found, which I'm sure they found across the world, is that they got more hours out of people than they were paying them for, and they got more done. And they're more productive, in other words, right? But if you notice, now that we're kind of out of that COVID hole where it seems to start bubbling up again almost, but now that we're out of that hole, it seems that, all these companies want to bring us back into the office, come back to the office. And I don't know, I'd like to see a study eventually. Are you getting the same productivity as you were when these people were working from home and they were comfortable? They could run around, take their kids where they need to, and grocery shop and everything else that they were doing. Probably in the factor of them actually spending time with one another, husband and wife, being able to be around each other a little more, it kind of helped out too. They're a family again. Are you guys finding that? Are you finding people are taking advantage of that? Companies are taking advantage of employees? Are you guys back to fully in the office? Is that what most of the companies, are they back fully in office in the UK, or are they allowing the work from home?
So the main push in the UK is towards, I'd say, at least 50% or around 50% minimum. There's always generally a minimum time in the office now.
Okay.
It used to be during the pandemic and perhaps the year or so afterwards that organizations had an epiphany, that they realized what was possible. We actually saw a lot of progress in terms of flexible working rights for everyone, due to everyone seeing the benefits. So it was one of those areas where progress in an area of DEI occurred because people perhaps unaffected typically by the need to have flexible working saw its benefits. But now there's other interests at play, such as we have an office, we need to use the building, or we're now not in those times anymore, so let's introduce hybrid working or reintroduce it, and really enforcing those minimum time policies. And it does end up really arbitrary, because hybrid can seem like a good compromise, but there will be some people that maybe won't be able to be as productive for you if you're requiring them in the office 3 to 4 days a week, because maybe they have chronic health conditions that mean that they have limited energy levels, levels. Or maybe your organization just hasn't done the work and is really not progressed in its anti-racism journey. And people are subjected to microaggressions or just experiencing isolation and cultural insensitivity or a culture shock. And as a result, they can't focus in the office in the same way that they would out of work. That's not an uncommon situation, actually, because it may be behaviors or actions that fall below the level of raising them through official channels, but do really take away from a person's experience in the workplace. And maybe they could have accessed more from those employees during that period of change or before the change has come, if they offered more flexible working arrangements, which will also affect commuters. A lot of people cannot live in central London, where many offices, for example, are, or in the center of whatever city it is, or in the business district. You will usually have more expensive restaurants in those areas. Transport costs will be higher, and many people do commute, in which case is the in-office by default culture considerate of the energy levels of commuters and whether they could instead use that time to give that to the company, which we were seeing. People were more generous with their time.
Yep. So same thing. Now that's interesting. So it didn't change from transatlantic area to transatlantic area. It's still the same. People would give more of their time. Okay.
Exactly.
Sophia, you have been awesome. And before we go, the floor is yours. Tell people what you want them to know about what they can do to make the world a better place in the world of D&I or anything you want to talk about. It's yours.
What a wonderful question to close on. I would say change won't be comfortable. Even thinking of change sometimes won't be comfortable. And I say that for me as well as other people. But what you need to consider, rather than the discomfort of change in your present self or your present organization and where it's at, is the impacts that you can have with those changes. How do you hang on to the good that you're afraid of losing? And being accountable to the future. Don't think about the discomfort of this present period of transition. Think about the future and the direction that things are changing. So this will often be the case with, for example, the use of non-disclosure agreements, because people will often be understanding that it's wrong to use gag orders, as they're usually called, in cases of discrimination and bullying and harassment and abuse and misconduct. But it will be an institutional reflex almost, and an individual reflex. Of course, even if we've resolved it and we try to fix it, we have to use a gag order because that's just the way it's done. It's not considering the general direction of change legally and socially, which is that these are falling out of favor. Transparency is actually the future, really. And transparency doesn't even necessarily encourage exposure, for instance. It just means that a lack of covering things up. So think about the future that you want to be in alignment with. Think about being accountable to your future self, to your future, and to the standards and values that the path that we're working towards is embodying.
And with that, thank you so much, Sophia. You are an official friend of the Median Society. Everybody that comes on becomes a friend of our Median Society. But thank you so much. And I want to thank our guest this evening for taking the time to listen to us. Don't hesitate to reach out to us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. Review our videos as we put them out. But on top of that, always look for the Median Society close and near and dear to you on any of your podcast stations, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other ones that are out there. I'm your host, Anthony Mitchell. Thank you, and we're out. Thanks for watching this latest episode of the Median Society with Anthony Mitchell. Please like and subscribe, and of course, hit that notification bell to be notified when our latest content is posted for your viewing pleasure. Thank you to all of our subscribers and friends of the Median Society for your ongoing support. We see you and appreciate you. My name is Austin Mitchell, the host of the Review Show, where we run back some of the most impactful clips from past and present episodes of the Median Society and discuss their relevance in our society's discourse. We also have exclusive interviews with Anthony Mitchell and provide insight on upcoming projects before they drop from TMS Studios. The Median Society is more than a show, but a coalition of change in and throughout communities across the world. To learn more about us, please visit tmsstudiosllc.com, and you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. And of course, with that said, we're out.